Come, Spirit of the living God, calm us and open our souls to receive a word from you. Breathe upon us and breathe upon the word that you have inspired, and be our interior master as we come into your presence to receive a word of healing and of light. We have in the Apocalypse this ritornello. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. It comes frequently from the pen of John the Divine, and it perhaps applies to our time more than ever in the history of the Church. What is the Spirit truly wanting to tell us? For it would seem that people are fairly good at putting words in the Spirit's mouth and saying this is what he wants. Is it necessarily the case? Are loud decibels always an expression of the voice of the Spirit? Is it not perhaps more likely to be true that the still small voice speaks in a different way? And in retreat, that different way is accessible to us. We need to just calm down and let the Lord do the talking. It is not enough to do our duty with regard to daily vocal prayer, the pensum, the officium. We need that desire to be with the friend of the soul and just to say, Lord, over to you, I want to hear your voice. And that voice comes through in people who have been close to him. In France, our lecturer used to tell us, Augustin was a holy monk, fréquentant de préférence les grands auteurs. And he would give us books that have withstood the test of time. One of the great theologians of our own generation is Joseph Ratzinger. He is known to have been the interest of the none other than Padre Pio of Pietrelcino. At a distance, he could see something. It came out in a testimony during the canonization of Padre Pio. There were things that then were made known which wouldn't otherwise have come to the surface, and one was this from a reliable source close to the horse's mouth. It was one of those who would be going to him to confession and had a certain rapport with him, and it was after initially the visit, I believe, of the young Karol Wojtyla, that at that point, I believe, if I remember the facts correctly, Padre Pio had said to this other one, that person one day will be Pope. And he added this bit, he will be a great fisher of souls. And to follow him will be another Pope who will be a great teacher. And both, he added, will be canonized saints. And I happen to have had in my hands the inside story, which is published in Italian, but not in English as far as I know as yet, the testimony of Georg Genswein. And it is not intended in any way to be polemic. It is the inside story of his wonderful relationship with this holy, gentle man. And he just reports. He has no axe to grind. He actually does it very well. And what comes through is the sheer beauty of the soul that he served until he died in his arms. And the atmosphere in the papal family, as it was called, was one of pure, serene love and mutual understanding. They understood each other perfectly, the sisters. And when it came to going from the papal apartment to the monastery in the papal gardens, the decision had to be taken who was going. And they could not in any way divide that papal family. All had to go together. And there are very interesting things that come through. Even the twinkle in the Pope's eye. Pope Benedict had a sense of humour, very German, but it was there. Never malicious, but he could say things cleverly. And the amazing way that they had détente on a Sunday evening is fascinating. You wouldn't think it, but he loved one of the sisters who could read well to read those famous sort of comic things of the priest, what's his name? Peppino or something, and the communist mayor. And there they were, and they would listen to this nun reading that. And the kind of music that he loves is indicated, and the liturgical life of the little family is gone into in some detail. I was amazed to find that in the years in which he was able to talk, because he lost his voice towards the end, he would immediately at the beginning of the week take the Gospel and the two accompanying readings of the coming Sunday, and over the week, the whole week, he would go into them in great depth. And he would, in Lectio Divina and Meditatio, pull out of them divinely all the layers of hidden meanings. And he would put notes down in such a way that when it came to the Sunday, they had gems of meditation from the retired Pope's mouth. And they realized what they had, and one of the sisters started to make sure that nothing was lost. So they're available if they ever wanted to be published. And also we notice the correct approach to the renewal of the said pontiff. He celebrated in Italian in the week with great interiority, in such a way that it was a mystical moment, showing where the attention was. And on a Sunday, together, they would celebrate in Latin. He had no axe to grind. He was somebody who, just by his person, exuded correct understanding of what the Spirit was saying to the churches. And one person who understood him well was his faithful liturgical servant, Guido Marini. And he shared his vision entirely. And we have, from his lips and pen, some interesting testimonies. This, for instance, came from him at the beginning of the year 2010, on January the 6th, at Vatican City. There is, he says, an urgent need to reaffirm the authentic spirit of the liturgy, such as it is present in the uninterrupted tradition of the Church, and attested, in continuity with the past, in the most recent magisterial teachings, starting from the Second Vatican Council up to the present pontificate. I purposefully used the word continuity, a word very dear to our present Holy Father. He has made it the only authoritative criterion whereby one can correctly interpret the life of the Church, and more specifically the conciliar documents, including all the proposed reforms contained in them. How could it be any different? Can one truly speak of a church of the past and a church of the future, as if some historical break in the body of the church had occurred. Could anyone say that the bride of Christ had lived without the assistance of the Holy Spirit in a particular period of the past, so that his memory should be erased, purposefully forgotten? Now, that's a discrete point, which is pointed as well, because if one listens to not so much the words, but the mode of speech of experts, one realizes that the problem is that the wider picture is not seen, and that also the Spirit himself is not being given space, because the Spirit was always the Spirit, and we're not the first to hear him in history. Indeed, when years ago the then Joseph Ratzinger wrote in some depth on the spirit of the liturgy, he was criticized by those who were experts in liturgy because they said he wasn't a liturgist. And his calm response was, the liturgy is too important to be handed over to experts. Nevertheless, at times it seems that some individuals are truly partisan to a way of thinking that is justly and properly defined as an ideology, or rather a preconceived notion applied to the history of the Church, which has nothing to do with the true faith. When I was still a Protestant in Wales, I was hit willy-nilly already in childhood by the fact that when my parents, who were modern language teachers, took us to the continent, we always found massive areas where there was only one church in a village. And it hit me how different and how historic and how powerful this bulldozer is, compared with our average Welsh village where you have 5 chapels, all within a few meters. There's a force in history. And one also saw in the various churches and shrines that God was very much active in that history. So many places commemorated interventions from on high. An example of the fruit produced by that misleading ideology is the recurrent distinction between the pre-conciliar and the post-conciliar church. Such a manner of speaking can be legitimate, but only on condition that two churches are not understood by it. One, the pre-conciliar church, has nothing more to say or to give because it has been surpassed. And the second, the post-conciliar church, a new reality born from the council and by its presumed spirit, not in continuity with its past. This manner of speaking, and more so of thinking, must not be our own. Apart from being incorrect, it is already superseded and outdated. Perhaps understandable from a historical point of view, but nonetheless connected to a season in the Church's life by now concluded. Now, the irony is that things have gone full circle since this was written, but at the time of his writing, that seemed the way forward. The reform of the reform, the going back to the basics of where we're coming from and applying it in continuity, the hermeneutic of continuity of Pope Benedict. Does what we have discussed so far with respect to continuity have anything to do with the topic we have been asked to treat in this lecture? Yes, absolutely, he says. The authentic spirit of the liturgy does not abide and is not approached with serenity. leaving aside all polemics with respect to the recent or remote past. Now, here we see not only the teaching, but the modality, and that we can take on board, because it's not always out there. In fact, I've deliberately opted not to have anything to do with internet except what I really have to for basics, because the stuff going on amongst Christians is not in the modality of love and peace. It's destructive and aggressive, and it's getting worse. And we need to be careful not to get contaminated by it, because precisely Pope Benedict was the one who gave the key as to how to handle theology. Do you know that when the young Genswein was working in another congregation in the Vatican, way down on the echelons, the Pope wanted his attention and invited him to go and see him. And Genswein, who in his younger days was a fan of the Beatles and had long hair, wondered what he had to say, whether he'd done something wrong. He went with fear and trembling to the papal apartment, having not the slightest notion what was needed and wanted or what was ahead. And with a wonderful, serene smile, Pope Benedict said what he wanted. He'd had his eyes on him, and he courteously asked would he like to become his private secretary. He was quite taken aback. But boy, did Pope Benedict, or Joseph Ratzinger at the time, have a good intuition, what was good for him. They bonded straight away. He never used the intimate form of du for the Pope, or vice versa. It was always si. But the intimacy was always there. They understood each other perfectly without a word. And they had also that little spark of wit which helped them along. And when he heard that he was to be transferred to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the young Genswein was happy, because he knew on the grapevine that that was the most peaceful and serene congregation in the Vatican. Why? Because Joseph Ratzinger was kind. And he would treat his people in this way. He introduced the weekly assembly of all concerned to discuss theological matters and things, and he would start with the youngest in the crowd, the least experienced, way down on the echelons. And everyone would listen with respect, and Joseph Ratzinger would never demolish. He would pull out the wonderful bits he'd seen, the good points in his presentation, and then calmly he would add, but there is something here that needs to be looked at which might not have been completely addressed. In other words, he would point out an extra bit which hadn't been caught sight of, in such a way that there was no putting down. The attitude was one of utter respect, and people picked it up. So that's the atmosphere in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith in all those years. And I know from fellow students that when he was working there, other seminarians going backwards and forwards in the Vatican area at that time in the morning, when he was passing to the office, he would calmly smile at them and greet them. He had time for everybody without wasting time. Courtesy. And then when, of course, it came to the, in a way, unexpected election, he followed him to the end at the Pope's request. And Pope Benedict, when he knew he had to eventually step down, was already preparing the way to keep Genswein safe. He gave him a post which involved being ordained an archbishop, and a post there which he expected would carry on as a bridge. But the way that was handled eventually is another story. he tells it in the book he's written. Anyway, apparently, Pope Francis said, "You look after the retired Pope." So he offered that himself, and he told that to the retired Pope. But amongst themselves, they said, "I am to be your guardian." And then amongst themselves, maybe the correct expression would be your prison guardian. So anyway, that was what ended. But they understood also how to make the best of a situation which was very, very difficult. With regard to the continuity, it's something which we need to take on board, because the only way to celebrate the present Mass well is to understand where each part of it comes from. There is no rupture. And it hit me actually recently when celebrating in the Old Rite, having preached on probably the future Saint Willie Doyle. He was a martyr of charity in the trenches. How it happened as I was celebrating there at the altar in the Old Rite, it hit me. This is the very same rite that was used there in those trenches. It's exactly the same, and it's the same exactly also as what was celebrated even in the Tower of London under terrible duress, and also in the Terror in France, and also in the penal times in Ireland under threat. And there was also a price on the head of priests. And indeed, near us is a place where a priest, on the way to celebrate Holy Mass during the penal times, was pulled off his horse by 4 strong men and martyred. The same rite exactly. Therefore, one cannot dismiss easily all these centuries of sanctity. One is in a situation of spiritual pride and presumption to think that we know more than all the saints who have celebrated this rite. Indeed, one of my first Masses was celebrated at the altar where Maximilian Kolbe had celebrated his first Mass in Rome, where Our Lady had appeared to a Jew. And there, even though it was the new rite, it was exactly the same grace and presence that was passing. This, then, is where the continuity lies. The same grace and presence, the same power, the same Lord. And that is where the attention should go, more sometimes than upon the rite used to protect it. Because by nature, the soul that looks at Jesus and is thinking of him at that point will celebrate well. And that is the problem in our time, whether the old or the new. Celebrating well and with love is what gives us continuity. That continuity which was so well expressed by the future, I would say, Saint and Doctor of the Church, Joseph Ratzinger.